Peace, family. Welcome to From Streets to the Statehouse, where we offer an analysis of the Maryland General Assembly that is rooted in Black liberation. I'm your host, Davon Love. This podcast is sponsored by Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, a grassroots think tank located in Baltimore, Maryland. We advocate for public policy issues that impact the Black community. I serve as its director of public policy. This show is powered by people like you who make it possible for us to do our work Sustainers are individuals or organizations who donate to LBS once a month. Your financial offering helps us to carry out our mission and remain independent and unapologetically Black. Become a sustainer. Go to lbsbaltimore.com/sustain. Once again, I'm Davon Love, your Director of Public Policy. This is our third year doing Streets to the State House. We really appreciate everybody that joins us each and every time. For those who listen live, for those who come back to listen later, we really appreciate that. This is our attempt at making information about the Maryland General Assembly available to the masses of Black people, to the masses of those who are interested in racial justice. We hope that this can help provide some information for you to do what is necessary as a person engaged in political life, to do the work of helping us pressure legislators to do the things that are in the best interest of Black people and the general public at large. So once again, I want to welcome everybody for coming back, for joining us. What I want to do is talk a little bit about, in addition to why we do this podcast, as I mentioned, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, we're a political advocacy organization. And, we've been doing legislative advocacy in Annapolis for several years at this point. And, for us, we want to make this process more accessible. For those who aren't familiar, Maryland state legislature is in session from January to April. And so this is a 90-day period where hundreds of pieces of legislation are pushed through and reviewed and up for hearings and are voted on. And these pieces of legislation impact a variety of different aspects of life, whether it's issues of public safety, economic development, tourism, the environment. They're all different kind of issues that are impacted, that impact all phases of life, that those policies are made in Annapolis. Annapolis is kind of in the cut, right? So a lot of people, you're not going to Annapolis unless you mean to go. And so, a lot of times the information about what goes on there is fairly insulated. So we're proud of the fact that we're able to offer you all just some information about that and information about the work that we're doing and some of our partners that are working towards racial justice, Black liberation. Before we jump into the particular content or the focus that we want to talk about this evening, we know that Black History Month starts tomorrow. Black History Month, which used to be Negro History Week, started by Carter Godwin Woodson. He's the author of Miseducation of the Negro, and in 1926 created Negro History Week. And unfortunately, a lot of people, when they think about Black History Month, it's the month you learn about the Black stuff, when in actuality, Carter Woodson would say that Negro History Week, as it once was, and Black History Month as it is now, should be the opportunity where we review all the things that we learned throughout the year about Black people. And this becomes when we highlight what we learned throughout the year. And so that's important because for Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, we're rooted in the tradition of Black liberation. And our approach to legislative advocacy is also rooted in that tradition. Too often when people think about legislation, people think about it, particularly as it relates to Black people, often that conversation centers around many of the traditional civil rights demands, right, which are important, but aren't the full scope of the kinds of legislative work and legislative advocacy that people of African descent have done over the course of our sojourn here in the Western Hemisphere, and particularly the United States. And so when we think about, for instance, here in Baltimore, Baltimore has a historic legacy, particularly in the late 19th century, of Black people organizing ourselves around access to public dollars, public education dollars, that Black people were not only excluded from white mainstream educational institutions, but Black people created our own institutions. Early in the late 18th century and all throughout the 19th century, Black people in the state of Maryland were educating ourselves and building institutions. And in the 1860s, there was legislative advocacy, including people like Isaac Myers, and others, Black people, Reverend Harvey Johnson of Union Baptist, Those were people who organized to do legislative advocacy to get access to public dollars for Black people, for Black educational institutions, right? That's important for us to know when we talk about legislative advocacy that is rooted in Black liberation. Or whether we're talking about the Universal Negro Improvement Association, founded by the Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey. You know, a lot of people know him for his mass organization and businesses, but a lot of people don't know that he actually at one point collaborated with some of the other advocacy organizations around anti-lynching legislation. UNIA was involved in legislation, and in fact, they disengaged from the anti-lynching legislation because, unfortunately, other partners of theirs were willing to compromise on anti-lynching legislation, were willing to pass weak legislation. UNIA wasn't willing to go along with that. So that is another example of the kind of legislative advocacy rooted in Black liberation. Or whether we're talking about some of the historic demands that come out of the 1960s and 70s around community control. For those who are following our work last session, we focused a lot on community oversight of law enforcement. That just wasn't an arbitrary thing that we decided was important. But when you look at the history of the Black liberation and the advocacy efforts, whether it's community control of law enforcement, whether it's community control of public education, community control of anti-poverty programs, you know, those are the kinds of legislative advocacy that is rooted in the notion of Black liberation, emptying into the importance of people of African descent being able to exercise sovereignty and true self-determination as the basis for our ability to practice freedom. So that's the paradigm from which we come out of. And, you know, again, when we think about Black History Month, Black people and our contributions of our work are not a reference, but a resource. And we use the resource of the bodies of work of people of African descent as the basis for how we do our work. That's important because today we're going to talk about a hot button issue in the Maryland General Assembly. Normally, during a lot of these podcasts, I would go over several issues. And in fact, we're actually going to do an episode next week. We normally wouldn't do these back to back, but we're going to do this episode. We're going to talk almost exclusively about the effort to legalize recreational cannabis in the state of Maryland. And we're going to focus exclusively on that because it's a tremendous political undertaking, has several different components to it. And so it's very important. We want to give it the time that it needs, especially since it's one of our biggest priorities during this legislative session. We want to really give it the time it needs. And our approach to legalizing recreational cannabis is rooted in that tradition that I just laid out. Because too often, particularly some of our progressive friends have framed the legalization of recreational cannabis primarily from the aspect of wanting to just merely stop some of the harm that's been done as a result of the war on drugs. And again, it's a quote that I use a lot when talking about our approach to cannabis legalization. Malcolm X, when he once said, "You can't put a knife in a person's back 9 inches, pull it out 3 and say you've made progress." We have to pull the knife out and begin to heal before we can say progress is made. And so, unfortunately, the conversation around stopping the harm is not enough. It's not enough to just say we're going to stop arresting people for cannabis. We're going to, stop, some of the incarceration and charging people for marijuana-related arrests. We have to repair the harm that's been done, right, to Black people. And so that's the approach that we've taken about legalizing recreational cannabis and reparations, right? The Black people are owed a debt as a result of the labor that we put into this country, but also as a result of the impacts of the war on drugs has had on Black people, that are demonstrative impacts that it's had on our community. So that's the approach that we've taken to this piece of legislation. And so we want to spend this entire episode really delving in, going deep, so that you all have all the information you need to help to be alongside of us advocating that we get good legislation passed. So here's how we're going to do this. So there are 3 major aspects to legalization of recreational cannabis. There are the kind of criminal justice related aspects that relate to, decriminalization, that dealing with people with criminal records. So dealing with some of the criminal justice aspects, the interactions with law enforcement. So that's one piece. The other piece are the tax revenues, right? What are we to do with the revenues that are produced by this industry? We don't want it to just go back into the general fund. Those resources need to come back to the community. So we're going to talk about that. And then we're going to talk about the business aspects, particularly ensuring Black participation in this multi-billion-dollar industry. So those are the three different parts. And with us this evening, as partners to help us to talk this through, we've been working with the ACLU of Maryland and also with the Office of Public Defender. And so we're actually going to bring on some guests to help us talk about cannabis. Yanet Amanuel from the ACLU of Maryland and Michelle Hall from the Office of Public Defender. So they're actually going to walk us through the criminal justice aspects of the legislation that we've been working on. And so they're going to go over that thoroughly. After they've done presenting on that, Lawrence Grandpre, our Director of Research, and myself will talk us through the tax revenues and the Black business participation aspect of this piece of legislation. And then after that, all of us will be on screen and we'll entertain questions, any questions that you have. I encourage you, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat so that we have them for the Q&A. We really want to answer any questions that people have. We really want to make sure people leave with the information they need to, again, advocate alongside of us as it relates to cannabis legalization. This is something that, as a community, that we have to get right. And so I'm glad to be able to have folks that can really help point us in the right direction in partnership on this work. So I'm going to turn it over to Yanet and to Michelle to lead us off on the first part of our conversation.
Thank you. So as Davon mentioned, my name is Yanet Amanuel, and I'm currently the Interim Public Policy Director at the ACLU of Maryland. And before kind of delving into what exactly the bill entails, I just wanted to start by sharing kind of a brief overview of the racist history of the criminalization of marijuana. So it may be surprising to some, but in the 17th century, the United States government actually encouraged farmers to grow hemp to produce materials like rope, sails, and clothing. Hemp could even be exchanged as legal currency in Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Maryland. And by the 19th century, marijuana was a popular ingredient in many of the medicinal products sold openly in public pharmacies. It wasn't really demonized as a violent drug until about the 1920s, and only after the recreational use of marijuana became associated with immigrants of color. So at the time, Mexicans were fleeing to the U.S. to escape the Mexican Revolution. And there was also people from the Caribbean settling in places like New Orleans. And recreational use of marijuana started to become associated with these immigrant populations. And the fear and prejudice about Spanish-speaking newcomers and immigrants became associated with marijuana. Also should note that a lot of jazz musicians were also associated with the recreational use of marijuana, which was also demonized by politicians and the white larger public. And by the 1930s, and we saw the marijuana tax of 1937 pass, making it so that it was that the importation, cultivation, possession, and distribution of marijuana could be regulated, and thus making it illegal. And so also at this time, the media started portraying the use of marijuana with violent crimes like rape and murder, and you had like the reefer madness going around. And it didn't stop there. The decades that followed include harsh penalties for the sale and ownership of the substance, including the war on drugs declared by President Richard Nixon in 1971, which disproportionately ruined the lives and freedom of Black people across the nation. I think it's also important to note that as marijuana became, as the decades went on, as marijuana became associated as a popular drug amongst white people, the mainstream kind of like stigma around it began to soften. And it wasn't necessarily described as a violent drug anymore, but something that just made people lazy. But regardless in the change of public perception, Black people have continued to suffer the brunt of the consequences of the criminalization of marijuana and still do today. So to start by first saying that when the General Assembly decriminalized possession of 10 grams of marijuana in 2014, it did so with the goal of reducing the unnecessary criminalization and mass incarceration of Black and brown people. However, simply just decriminalizing small possession of amounts of marijuana and allowing the expungement of minor marijuana convictions has proven to have insignificant impact in actually reducing the over-policing of Black and brown people. And actually reducing the racial disparities in arrests for marijuana possession or other marijuana-related offenses. So in reality, actually, racial disparities have just continued to progressively get worse. And this is largely because since the criminalization of marijuana, and even today, Black people are associated with marijuana in a way that frames Black people as inherently criminal, whereas white people who continue to use marijuana are seen as recreational or medicinal. And the result is that, and as a result, Black people continue to be criminalized, and as compared to white persons, despite comparable rates of use. And so we've seen the national trends reveal that on average, a Black person is 3.64 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession. In some Maryland counties, Black people are arrested at double the national average. So for instance, in Queens Anne County, Black people are 8 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana. In Carroll, Cecil, and Frederick, Black people are 6 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana and 5 times more likely in Allegheny. And what we've seen since the decriminalization in 2014 is that there's been an uptick in possession with intent to distribute charges. Specifically, according to the 2015 Uniform Crime Report, as compared to 2014, arrests for possession of marijuana decreased 37%, while distribution arrests increased 5% in 2015. So what this trend suggests is that at least some portion of persons in possession of 10 grams or less are now being charged with distribution offense, when the offense may in fact be more appropriately charged as possession. So in other words, law enforcement has found a way around the decriminalization law because they can no longer prosecute persons for possession of small amounts of marijuana. They are instead prosecuting persons for possession with intent to distribute, even for very small amounts. And additionally, the odor of marijuana has often been used as an excuse for police to stop and search people, which has been disproportionately been people of color. And so what essentially this has done is allowing this practice to continue has allowed for police to have been granted the authority to search on something that cannot categorically be proven, and a claim based solely on their own sense of smell. And is essentially created an avenue by which police officers may use the law in order to justify racial profiling. And what we know and what the data confirms is that the criminalization of Black people for marijuana is not an effective public safety strategy, nor does it serve the purpose of public safety. So, for example, between 2018 and 2019, in Prince George's County arrested nearly 3,000 people for the possession of marijuana, over 10 grams. 90% of which were Black, although Black people only make up at least 65% of the county's population. And at the same time, that same year, there was only 18% clearance rate of all violent crimes in Prince George's County. So what this proves is that criminalizing Black people for the possession or consumption of marijuana is an ineffective strategy to actually solving violent crime or identifying the drivers of violent crime in our community. So at the same time, the legal industry in the United States is booming, with a projected revenue about around $89 billion by 2025. However, only 4% of the cannabis businesses are actually Black owned. And so the contrast between the booming legal marijuana market and the continued criminalization of Black people for marijuana use and the lack of opportunity to gain access to the industry is just simply unacceptable. And it is precisely because of this that the state, as we're getting ready to legalize and capitalize off of marijuana sales, that we must embrace broad reforms that will retroactively offer redress for the consequences of the criminalization of marijuana and its racist enforcement. So that's why this session, the ACLU of Maryland, along with our partners at Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle and the Office of the Public Defender and many other groups will be supporting legislation that will be introduced by Senator Jill Carter, and that we see as a companion to the referendum bill. And so I'm going to go into just a few details about what the bill does on the criminal legal side, and then I'll kick it over to Michelle. So first, the bill will legalize marijuana for Marylanders who are 21 and over. The bill also has safeguards that ensures that those who are found in violation of the bill's provisions are not faced with unreasonable financial burden. So for example, there's just $150 civil fine for anyone in violation of the bill's provisions, but also allows for persons to complete community service in lieu of a fine. So it's not further a burden to those who may not be able to afford the fine. And then any identifying information that is obtained in collection of the civil fines is not to be shared with other law enforcement entities. And for our young people who may be found in violation of the bill's provisions, they will be provided about information about harms of underage marijuana use, and it would also just be a civil penalty, which again could be community service could be served in lieu of the fine. Another thing this bill does that I think is critical and sometimes is overlooked is that it simply requires that the same rules that govern cigarette smoking apply to smoking cannabis. So essentially, anywhere you can smoke a cigarette, you can smoke cannabis. And I think it's really critical because making it a crime or even a civil penalty to smoke marijuana in public will enable the same racially based policing to occur. And we want to limit unnecessary interactions with police. And this is really critical because many people who are already marginalized do not have the luxury of consuming marijuana in private. For example, persons in multi-generational households. If the younger family member wants to smoke marijuana but an elder objects, the person would just smoke outside. To be respectful to their family's wishes without facing criminalization, and they should be able to do so. Additionally, homeless persons have literally no inside in which they can consume marijuana and should not have to suffer unnecessary interactions with the police just simply because we're criminalizing smoking outside. So I think that's an important component of the bill. Next, our bill will seek to prohibit police from using the odor of marijuana without other legitimate cause or suspicion as a requisite for a probable cause to arrest or perform a warrantless search of a person or vehicle. It's critical that our efforts this session is not just about legalizing marijuana or putting it in a referendum, but it's also about de-incentivizing unnecessary stops by police for searches and seizures and protecting Black and Brown people from further violations of their Fourth Amendment rights. And so this provision will prevent officers from relying on the odor of marijuana to justify stopping and searching Marylanders, and essentially codifies recent Court of Appeals decisions in several recent cases dealing with odor searches. For instance, under the recent 2020 decision in Lewis, the Court of Appeals found that there is no probable cause to search a person without the warrant based on the smell of marijuana alone. And in 2021, the Court of Special Appeals decision in DD extended the Lewis decision to investigatory stops, finding that the smell of marijuana alone does not create reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. And this provision simply extends that to vehicles, similar to how New York just did in the bill that they just passed to legalize marijuana. And then additionally, this bill will allow for vacature of previous marijuana-related convictions and mandate opportunities for new evidentiary hearings and vacature for those currently serving time for marijuana-related convictions and other low-level felonies and misdemeanors if those charges stem from a conviction based on the search due to the odor of marijuana as well, and is believed to have been an intrusion of the individual's Fourth Amendment rights. So this aspect of the bill is basically a look back to give some relief to those who the basis of their conviction was gathered from the interaction of an odor search. It requires that they're entitled to a hearing and allows us to offer redress to those who have already been harmed by the war on drugs. And it's because the war on drugs It is because of the war on drugs that so many people are currently saddled with criminal records, and it's important that those who have already gone through the system or are currently in the system have an opportunity to clear their records if their convictions are marijuana related or the charges arose from an officer detecting odor of marijuana. And it's important to note that vacature means that the mistake is made in the original conviction and actually undoes the actual adjudication. So it's not the same thing as expungement or shielding, and actually goes a step further. And lastly, I will just mention that additionally, what the bill does is ensure that there's that the legal use of marijuana cannot be the basis for denying someone housing, making child custody or visitation determinations, or negatively impacting someone's parole probation status. This provision essentially will begin to address some of the ripple effects of the criminalization of marijuana, and is also really critical. It's really critical that's included in any final passage of marijuana legalization this session. So I think that pretty much sums up the criminal legal side of this bill, and I will turn it over to Michelle.
Thanks, Yanet, and thank y'all for having me again. And if you guys just joined, you should make sure you go back to the beginning and watch the intro because it was tough. It was a really tough intro. It was really tight. My name is Michelle Hall. I'm a public defender with the Office of the Public Defender. I started with our office in 2018, and I began representing children in Prince George's County in juvenile court and children who were charged as adults. Now I do appeals, and so after a person loses a case, I'm the one that litigates a case on appeal to say that that conviction should be reversed. And that that person's conviction should be thrown out. And Yanet wanted me to talk a little bit about how marijuana has played out since decriminalization and what we see in our work, and why this bill is important to the work that we do at the Office of the Public Defender. So since decriminalization, and as Yanet said, the whole purpose of decriminalization was first to deprioritize marijuana enforcement, and this is really made clear in the legislative history that enforcing marijuana laws and closely policing marijuana laws was not something that the legislature believed should be prioritized at the expense of investigating more serious and violent crimes, right? And so decriminalizing marijuana was a way to deprioritize that, and to also recognize the disproportionate enforcement of marijuana laws had led to so many of our Black brothers and sisters that are in our prisons and jails here in Maryland, and really the over-criminalization of Black communities. But as has been made clear, really in every court case since decriminalization is not the same as legalization. And so it hasn't gone, as Yanet said, as far in deprioritizing marijuana enforcement and really getting at some of the roots of that disproportionate enforcement that I think some of the legislators wanted to see. So even though it is true that marijuana is not the same priority that it used to be, in part because it is more difficult to prove that the plant that an individual has is marijuana, because in 2019, and this is getting a little bit more in the legislative weeds, right? But in 2019, the legislature legalized hemp, kind of going back to the beginning of that history that Yanet was talking about the government wanting to incentivize growing hemp for all of the reasons, rope and all that stuff, right? So in 2019, our legislature as well legalized hemp. And as some of you probably know, marijuana and hemp come from the same plant, the same cannabis plant. And the only way to distinguish between the two is by testing for the THC level. And if it's over 0.3%, that means you have marijuana. If it's under 0.3%, that means you have hemp. So what that means is that the ways that we used to be able to distinguish if someone had what was illegal marijuana by just smelling it, or in the lab by just looking at it under the microscope and saying, yes, that's marijuana, is no longer sufficient to prove that something is marijuana. And so in many respects, a lot of marijuana cases have simply not been able to go forward because it's more difficult to prove. Marijuana has to be sent to different drug labs in order to prove that it is in fact marijuana by testing those THC levels. And you're not going to do that for every possession of 10, 20 grams of marijuana, right? But at the same time, marijuana is still used as a justification for many police interactions and many police intrusions, because, again, as I said, that the court has emphasized, decriminalization is not the same as legalization of marijuana. So the odor of marijuana can still be used and is still regularly used to justify stops and frisks. And so these are examples of cases that myself and my colleagues have seen. So a group of people who are standing outside, and an officer says that they can smell marijuana, and the officers use that as a basis to approach that group and stop them, and ultimately frisk that group of people, right? And so you see how just the odor of marijuana, that is the basis that the police are using to justify that intrusion, and go over to that group of people. One of the biggest ways, though, that I think the odor of marijuana gives the police really carte blanche to interfere on people's constitutional rights is in vehicle stops. Vehicles don't have as many protections as I think many people believe that they do. There's a case from the 1920s called Carroll from the United States Supreme Court that basically says if an officer has probable cause to believe that a vehicle has evidence of a crime or contraband, they can search that car. That case is from Prohibition, and when people were worried about running alcohol across state lines and stuff. But really, that has a lot of similarities with marijuana, right? And so since that case in the 1920s, really all of our automobile law allows for police to search vehicles anytime that they believe they have probable cause that a vehicle has evidence of a crime or contraband. And under the decriminalization paradigm, marijuana in any amount is contraband unless obviously you have a medical marijuana license. So that means that the odor of marijuana is used and is continually used to justify police searches of vehicles. And a case called Robinson in 2014 made that abundantly clear from our court, right? So even though marijuana is decriminalized, which is an important step, it doesn't go far enough at all to protect and stop the types of intrusions that we are worried about. So this bill, both in the prospective application of saying that an officer cannot use the odor of marijuana, burnt or raw, and some other indicia as well to begin a Fourth Amendment intrusion, as well as the retrospective parts, giving people some relief for past marijuana convictions and things, is important to get at, and I think get us over that hurdle that decriminalization simply didn't get us over. One of the main ways that I think this case is important in the work that we do is that right now there are no checks on odor. So by that I mean we've had a lot of legislative changes in the past several years. For example, body-worn cameras, trying to have additional police oversights, and we can debate separately how strong those are or not, right? But there's actually no way to prove when an officer says, I walked up to the car window and I smelled the odor of marijuana, as so many happens in so many traffic stops, right? There's actually no way to prove or disprove that what the officer said was true. And even if an officer doesn't recover any marijuana, we know smoke and the odor of smoke carries on people's clothes. It carries, if you were smoking in the car, or you weren't smoking in the car, there's no way to know how long that odor has been there, right? And there's no way to know if there was no odor at all. So it's really impossible to prove or disprove that an officer did or didn't smell marijuana. And so an officer being able to say, I smelled marijuana and I used that to search the car, there's really not much that we can do to protect people's Fourth Amendment rights so long as an officer is able to conduct a vehicle search based on the odor of marijuana alone, right? I also think this bill puts important safeguards at the beginning of what is a lawful police intrusion or not. Oftentimes I get calls from my clients, isn't what they did illegal, and can't we get this thrown out? And unfortunately, the truth is, once you've been arrested and charged with a crime, it's a super long and arduous process in order to vindicate your rights and to have your day in court, right? And if you lose, then it comes to the job that I'm doing now to argue on appeal that the trial court got it wrong. And so cases can linger for months, if not years. And in COVID, we have seen cases linger for an incredibly long amount of time, right? And so we need it to be clear at the outset what the police are able to do and what information they're able to use to conduct further investigation. And this bill, importantly, defines that. I also say, it takes the law an incredibly long time to catch up to the legislative changes. So if this bill passed, when decriminalization passed, it didn't say anything about what does the odor of marijuana mean for a police intrusion? What does seeing someone with a joint, what does that mean for police intrusion, right? And so that means that we are litigating those cases in the courts for years afterwards. We're still litigating cases. Lewis was in 2020 and DD was in 2021. Those are two cases that are still dealing with what type of stop and what type of seizure police are able to do under decriminalization, right? Which was 8 years ago at this point. And so you can see how it takes an incredibly long time to develop the case law and to develop it in a way that we believe comports with the intentions of the law. And so that's why it's important to include those things in the law up front. And then finally, I would just close by saying that, what we see and what was clear to me in my work is that the marijuana and marijuana laws are disproportionately enforced and are still disproportionately enforced. And part of that is because of the gap that is left with decriminalization. And we're still, by only decriminalizing marijuana, Blackness is still linked to criminal activity, and marijuana is still linked to Blackness and criminal activity, and the odor of marijuana can still be used to justify all types of police intrusions that, quite frankly, we're not seeing in white communities. We're not seeing on colleges. We're not seeing, police being able to just, well, they are able to, in many instances, stop and search cars and things like that, but they are not utilizing those tools in that type of way in those communities. And that's why it's so important to say in this bill, and to be able to say, we're not just saying that it is great to be able to smoke marijuana recreationally if you want to, but that also this has real teeth and protections for people, because otherwise, even if we get legalization without putting these protections in place, it's still going to be a long fight to get the law to what we want in this bill, and what I think we really want when we talk about legalization, because it doesn't just mean that you can, enjoy yourself, but it also means that the police can't intrude on you for, taking part of legalization. So I'm happy and looking forward to answering other questions that people have going forward. And thanks for having me here.
All right. So thank you both for giving us a rundown on that. Again, I think it's really important for people to note that legalizing recreational cannabis, we have to deal with the way in which it is used to criminalize Black people and increase interactions with law enforcement. So really glad that y'all were able to lay out all the different dimensions of that. So we're going to quickly transition now to talking about the tax revenues and the business participation aspect of it. So I'm going to bring on my man, 100 Grand, our Director of Research, Lawrence Grandpre. And we're going to talk about, again, the tax revenues and the business aspects of this. So, as I mentioned, in addition to repairing the harm that's been done by the war on drugs as it relates to the policies of how law enforcement treats our community, and making sure that people can get some kind of reprieve from the criminal records that have been created as a result. We also have to look at the distribution of resources. This is a multi-billion-dollar industry across the United States. Billions of dollars stand to be made as a result of it. And so we think it's vitally important to make sure that Black people are the primary beneficiaries of this industry, right? And so one of the places where LBS has been the most ardent in our advocacy is on the issue of the tax revenues, right? Where those tax revenues go. But also we want to weigh in on the business aspect of it as well. That's true. We'll talk about it later in terms of how tremendously complex that aspect of it is. And so what I'm going to do first is I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're advocating for in terms of how the tax revenues come back to our community. And then, I'm going to ask Lawrence to speak a little bit to that. And then after that, we'll talk about the business side. So tax revenues. So when you think about, many industries that have emerged, whether it's, sports betting, slots, the question of where those revenues go have been important, because it as a source of revenue, we don't want the dollars that are produced by the industry to just go back into the general fund. Again, Black people have been undermined and oppressed as a result of the policies of marijuana prohibition. And so, again, we want the revenues to come back to our community. Now, I don't think that that's a controversial claim. I think we're in a moment now, especially with this kind of new racial justice awakening that's happening across the board, so-called racial justice awakening, that I think that on the surface, there's some pretty wide agreement in principle that resources should come back to the communities impacted by the war on drugs. The question is how those resources come back. And this is a place that requires a deeper conversation. Actually, a few weeks ago, LBS, we did a panel that included Danielle Terrain and Shauna Murray Brown. I would encourage people to go back and look at that. We talked about community investment. And the reason why I'm mentioning that is because one of the larger challenges of getting resources into the community is the fact that there are not enough sufficient community-controlled Black containers, that institutional containers, by which large sums of public dollars can be distributed down into the community, right? When I say containers, I'm talking about things like community development corporations or fiscal sponsorship entities, right? These are the kinds of entities that traditionally can take large sums of money and put it out into the community. And unfortunately, and one of the things that people know LBS, particularly in Baltimore, our work around challenging the nonprofit industrial complex and the way that white folks are able to build an infrastructure for which they control resources go into it, and our community, particularly in terms of the grassroots, don't get access to those dollars. And that's something that LBS has been very, very adamant in addressing. And around the country, when you look at many of the states that have legalized cannabis, it's been many of your traditional, progressive, corporate, white-led nonprofit organizations that in many cases have positioned themselves to be the biggest recipients of the dollars that come as a result of this business that are intended to address some of the harms done by the war on drugs. So we advocate that the 60% of the tax revenues go directly to each of the 24 jurisdictions in Maryland. The percentage that each jurisdiction gets will be calculated by that jurisdiction's contribution, its percentage of the overall state of Maryland's marijuana-related arrests over the past 20 years. So this would not be a prospective thing where it's every year it's being calculated, but over the past 20 years, that it will be calculated based on the proportion of the contribution of that jurisdiction to their percentage of the marijuana arrests in the state of Maryland. Those resources will go directly to those jurisdictions, but not straight to the executive. That we believe that it should be a ordinance in each of those county councils, in the case of Baltimore City Council. What that will do is to provide the public the greatest opportunity to be able to have a say in how those resources are spent. Now, I know what some people may be thinking, like, I don't trust local government. I don't want it to go to the city council. They do a bunch of stuff I don't like. And while it is true, we're in a climate where, it's a rational thing to feel like the local governments, you don't trust them. But our argument is that, one, at the state level, you have less ability to hold any state agency accountable for things that are happening in your particular community jurisdiction. Secondly, is that locally, even though it may be the case that your local political landscape may not be as friendly to these kind of issues as you like, it at least provides an opportunity for the community to put pressure on local governments. So while it's not an ideal frame, ultimately we'd want to have established these Black community controlled intermediary entities that we could just trust to give money to and give it out. But in the absence of that we think it makes the most sense for the councils for the decisions about resources go to councils, the local legislative bodies, so that the community has a say with guardrails, right? So it wouldn't just they be able to spend it on anything. And so the guardrails that we've recommended are things like the money could not be spent on law enforcement, that it can't supplant existing government programs and services. So they can't use money to pay for something and then do something else with the parts of the budget. That would have to demonstrate that the efforts being funded are attempting to repair the harm done by the war on drugs, that low-income communities benefit from the programming. So these are the types of guardrails that we're recommending, and of course, reporting requirements, so that the jurisdictions would have to report to the General Assembly on what's being funded for additional oversight. So certainly with guardrails to protect against some kind of fringe way of spending those dollars. Again, we think this is the best way to give the community the power that it needs to be able to pressure its local government and its ability to make sure that those resources go to the community in a way that actually empowers the community. So that's what I have to say on the tax revenue piece. Lawrence, you have anything you want to add to that before we talk about the business aspect of it?
Yeah. So every state that's legalized cannabis so far has claimed to do some version of reparations for the war on drugs. And I think, unfortunately, really every state has come woefully short in accomplishing that objective, not necessarily for nefarious reasons. Part of it was ignorance. This is a new reality in America. But part of it is just not having a methodology, a theory of how to use policy to promote community empowerment from the bottom up. So just a very, very, very brief overview of what other states have done. Many of the states that started this off were in the West. They were in states that either didn't have a large Black population or didn't have a tradition, a theory of grassroots empowerment. So the tax money went all over the place. In Colorado, it's more libertarian. I believe they actually refunded a portion of the budget, basically arguing, oh, we had overcharged our citizens too much tax revenue. We're going to give them a tax rebate, basically. So that's one thing they did. In California, they obviously had medical cannabis for a long time, but when they legalized, they basically gave a lot of money to the universities and the sort of nonprofit industrial complex tied to the universities, but they also gave a lot of money to the cops. So there are small town police departments in California whose police budgets have increased 15-20% just off of cannabis taxation revenue. So some of the other states have done this so poorly that some of the states that came after them basically said, we learned from those other states. We've taken those lessons, and they have their own version of what they say is an improved approach. But we, upon studying it, kind of realized that what they're doing is, in trying to solve one problem, they've just recreated another problem. So the example that many people will talk about is the state of Illinois. If you talk to many mainstream Democratic Party think tank type folks, Illinois is the golden standard for cannabis legalization strategies, because they have this 20% or 25% of the whole tax revenue for the entire state go into this R3 fund, restore, renew, recover. And they basically have a methodology whereby they center all the money in the state capital of Springfield, Illinois, and they have these criteria determining who can apply for funds, and they have this panel decide who can give out that funding. And there are like 9 people on the panel, and like 3 of them, by mandate of the ordinance, should be returning citizens, formerly incarcerated people. And I looked at this, and I sort of, because when you see formerly incarcerated people, you say, oh, that's great, that's bottom up, that's grassroots. And then you think about it, and you say, wait, these people are political appointees from the House and the Senate. The lieutenant governor is the chairman of the entire panel. And when you look at the returning citizens who got on the board, they're all deeply connected to very, very powerful nonprofits throughout the state. So you just realize that this is actually a great tool to create what really is a top-down sort of, again, like Davon said, big box nonprofits getting the money, but to create the illusion of public accountability. And when you look at who actually got the funding, it's stuff that you can imagine. It's folks that are, doing basketball leagues, basically stuff that people were already doing. They get more money to do what they already were doing, and they get to claim whatever they were doing is something totally different than it actually is. So you have a basketball league, it's like, that's cool, but you look at how it's categorized in the R3 portfolio, they call that violence reduction. Now, just because you want to play basketball doesn't mean you will be beating up kids when you're not on the basketball court. Violence reduction, in my opinion, and when you actually look at the data and the science and the experts from the community, is a very intentional, targeted, spiritual practice where you need great degrees of expertise to do it. That's what I think people think is getting funded when they see millions of dollars for violence reduction, but it's really just the YMCA doing the same youth program and they already have been doing, but getting a new pot of revenue to do it. And I think that really violates one of the core tenets of reparations, is that the people who are aggrieved, who are harmed, need to have a mechanism themselves to decide what is actually going to repair the harm that is done to them. That's the difference between investment and reparations. You can give money to anything and call it investment. An investment's not inherently bad, but reparations should be focused on restoring power to the people who were aggrieved by the harm, in this case, the war on drugs. And when you look at how Illinois designed who gets to apply for the money, the very clear metric is 3 years of audited financial statements, being able to demonstrate an evidence-based, specifically public health methodology with empirical academic evaluations. Who can afford that? Who has that? It's the nonprofits who are connected to large philanthropic institutions or large academic institutions. So you don't even have to say anything else. You've already pre-selected out the actual grassroots nonprofits who, when you hear the word reparations, you say, hey, someone may have been formerly incarcerated. Someone may have formerly engaged in street economy or the so-called legacy market for cannabis. Those are the people who people think are getting that money when you say reparations. But when you do it the way Illinois has done it, which, of course, is how many people are saying Maryland should do it, what you select for is these institutions that already have this institutional methodology and not the actual bottom-up people who are most aggrieved by the war on drugs. And I think that's a critical example of what the problem is. Now, what's the solution? So I'll give a very imperfect example, and I'll try to explain how we're going to try to do better than what this actually turned out as. So you have the state of Illinois. The state of Illinois has a suburb of Chicago called Evanston. Evanston is where, if you know Northwestern University, it's a very elite private university, that's where that university is. So this is a college suburb, very affluent. They have a small pot of money from cannabis sales, local cannabis sales. They have a piggyback tax, a local tax. And they basically took like a couple $100,000 and had these big contentious city council debates and said that we're going to put this into a reparations program for descendants of slavery in America. And it's really just down payment assistance in Evanston for people who are Black, and that's trying to say that's going to repair the harm of the war on drugs. Now, I bring that up not because that's a perfect program. I don't think it is by any stretch of the imagination. But the fact that they could do that locally is because of the theory Davon just laid out. It was very contentious, but because you have more ability to touch your people locally, they were able to push what they saw as a radical program of reparations locally when they could not do that statewide in Springfield, Illinois for the R3 program. Now, of course, the problem is that's a few patches of down payment assistance, $30,000, $40,000 a piece for a few Black families. It really shows the limitation of methodology when we don't have containers, actual democratically accountable containers for that local money. What we can get is a couple of batches of down payment assistance. But with this argument, this reparations methodology we're talking about, if we invest in grassroots community accountable containers, so we have the opportunity to push the localities to do that. We don't have to just settle for a couple of batches of down payment assistance. We can actually create sustainable, long-lasting institutions that can actually create sustainable programming in our communities. But it's when that money goes to a local level, we can push for potentially more radical solutions. Now, again, what those solutions will be, that's what everyone says. And it's the last thing I'll say. Where does the money go to? What's the money go to? And I think we have to reframe that question in our minds, because the very nature of reparations is that the people who are aggrieved should decide what the money goes to. So I literally can't tell you what they will spend the money on, because that's the whole point. They should have the freedom and the space to decide for themselves what the money gets spent on. And that's the type of framework, the legal framework, that we're trying to get this money to go towards.
So one quick thing I want to add to that, this piece around the power of, being able to use the levers of local government. One of the things for folks who were following last session, the work on policing in HB 670, that requires, and it creates a new disciplinary matrix for discipline officers. It does increase more civilian participation. One of the things that it requires is the establishment of police accountability boards in every jurisdiction in Maryland. And one of the things we're seeing is that because it's not something that goes straight to the executive, it is given people in different counties, in Calvert County and Frederick County and other places around the state. It's given many of them the ability to push back against, for instance, boards that would have all law enforcement on them, right? It's given them the ability to push back on that. Just as a real-time example of how, empowering the local councils is helping, local communities be able to organize on some of those issues. All right, on the business participation aspect of it. So couple of big picture things before we jump into some specifics. The first, as I mentioned in the beginning, the business and regulatory stuff is tremendously complicated. I'm sure Lawrence will speak a little bit to that when I kick it back to him in a moment. Tremendously complicated. We're in a very experimental context when it comes to actually trying to ensure Black business participation. And the two major big picture things that I want to offer that go beyond the issue of recreational cannabis. The first is that the market forces are tremendous because this is something that federally is still not legalized. And so it's constrained to the providence of individual states, right? So there's certain access to federal sources of capital, right, that just aren't available. And so the wealth disparity between, white folks and Black people and other people of color is just tremendous. And so the market forces really impede the ability to develop government interventions that could easily address the wealth disparities, right? And so what I mean by that is just the level of capital it takes to, build a quality dispensary, quality growing practices, the security, the transportation, like what it takes to actually grow it at a commercial scale. It's just extremely capital intensive and Black people generally are at a competitive disadvantage. So again, this is an important big picture piece because a part of what the problem, one of the major problems we're trying to solve and making sure that Black people can have sufficient participation is how to counteract that with government interventions. And it's just difficult when the market forces are so tremendous, because with those market forces being so tremendous and the wealth disparities being as they are, it provides an opportunity for folks to circumvent regulations that may be intended to counter some of the disparities in wealth. Secondly, and again, this is something that goes beyond recreational cannabis, is that because of the way that the Constitution has been interpreted, when there have been attempts at race-specific policies aimed to empower particular people, in our case, Black people, that's something that has been challenged legally as unconstitutional. And so there are many questions. So now there are ways around it, right? And so if there's a disparity study done, then it justifies the ability to target policies based on race. But again, it's one of those things, it's a very tricky thing. And so it's something that as Black people, particularly in a state that is 31 or so percent Black, I think it's very important for us to begin to think more carefully about how to, direct policy in ways that can actually explicitly talk about the importance of empowering Black people legislatively. And so as a result of that challenge, that's just something that's just going to be it creates a challenge as it relates to making sure the legislation can be crafted in a way that actually accomplishes the goal. So in terms of some of the specific things that we offer, and again, both on the criminal justice aspects that Michelle and Yanet mentioned and the tax revenue portions, we're super clear about what we feel needs to be in the bill. And the things that we mentioned are things that have to be in the bill that pass. But on the business side, we have a few recommendations, things that we feel strongly about because we know that at least will help as it relates to Black business participation. The first is investment in technical assistance and capacity building. So, if a lot of small Black entrepreneurs don't have access to the capital to get the resources to build their infrastructure to compete in the marketplace. And so it's important for there to be investment in some technical assistance and capacity building so that it can help even the playing field. And there's an existing small minority women business fund that exists exactly for that purpose. And so a part of what our legislation would do is invest in the ability of that existing fund to be able to expand its work and be able to effectively assist those that want to get into the industry, particularly on some of the less capital intensive aspects of it. Secondly, the point system that will be used to determine which businesses would be able to get licensed, particularly on the grower and dispensary side, that the criteria that will be used is a criteria that would incentivize those that do business with Black businesses or minority businesses, but also criteria that would elevate applications from folks that are doing work in their local community, that are hiring, that are engaging people locally, that are owned by folks for whom are members of groups that have been disproportionately impacted negatively by marijuana prohibition. And then lastly, we want a third of those licenses, given our proportion in the population on grower dispensary level, we want a third of those licenses to be reserved for Black people. And the way we hope to get around some of the constitutional challenge is to say that people who are members of groups that have been disproportionately impacted by marijuana prohibition, that characterization, because of the tremendous scientific evidence of Black people being so disproportionately impacted by it, I think it's pretty clear and could potentially get around that challenge, and that's something that we're going to be working with our partners to try to move that forward. And then lastly, particularly in terms of some of the less capital intensive industries, again, we talked about technical assistance, but also if there are caps in the amount of licenses that will be given to not just growers, but people doing security, transportation, social consumption sites, that would be an emphasis or preference for Black businesses. So that's really the biggest part of our approach to the business side. Again, it's tremendously complicated. It's one of those things that it's really difficult for anyone to really claim that there's a solid answer to addressing this problem. The problem of the capital intense nature of the industry and the inability to target policy specific to race, how difficult that is. So those are the things we're up against, but we think that those suggestions will help lend us more in the direction of meaningful Black participation in the industry. What I want to do is kick it to Lawrence. One of the things that has happened in other states on the business side is the development of an Office of Social Equity. So using this whole social equity applicant piece as the mechanism to get Black people access to business opportunities. So I want Lawrence to take a few moments to just discuss why it is that LBS decided that wouldn't be the best approach in terms of getting Black people access to business opportunities.
So let me just describe the criteria that has been in Maryland bills and has been used in bills in other states to basically get around the constitutional limitation on race-specific set-asides in policy to other states to try to basically use other language to support a general goal of minority participation, and why we feel that has not been effective and why we took a different approach. So diversity applicant is a weird term. Most people obviously don't have a natural understanding of what that means. So here's how people have defined it in the context of cannabis. So diversity applicants, the goal is, again, to incentivize certain behaviors that people see as representative of being harmed by the war on drugs, or creating a business designed to repair some of that harm. So here, some of the criteria people have used is, have you personally been incarcerated or charged with convicted of a crime directly related to cannabis? So if you personally have been convicted of a crime, then that's one thing that could qualify you as a diversity applicant. Can you prove that you lived in a zip code that has been proven to be disproportionately impacted by cannabis prohibition policing? So have you lived in the areas that were targeted for hyper-incarceration for the war on drugs? That can qualify you as a diversity applicant. Do you have proof that over 50% of the ownership of your company, or 50% of the people on the board of directors, are individuals who themselves have either been incarcerated or live in these areas, right? Do you have a clear track record of being able to hire more than 50% of the people who work at your business from these areas? So you can basically create a heat map. You can look at the rest over 15, 20 years, back when cannabis prohibition was at its height, the 90s and 2000s, before decrim in I think it was 2014. And you can create a map of these areas. Now, nowhere did anybody say that it just goes to Black people, because just saying that it's not totally unconstitutional, but you have to basically meet a specific higher burden of proof to tailor solutions specifically for Black people, i.e. showing a historical pattern of inequity in the particular industry. So this seems to be good. It seems to be an elegant solution that many progressives have sought up to support different strategies, like trying to reserve transportation licenses. A lot of people don't go to dispensaries. They get the weed delivered to them like Uber Eats. And people were saying, well, let's just have the transportation industry all diversity applicants and only diversity applicants. Isn't that a solution that solves the problem? Now, this brings up some of the analysis around what people might know about affirmative action, minority business set-asides, that because of the inability to explicitly say only Black people should get this, when people said, oh, minority, oh, people have been excluded, well, women have been excluded. Women are minorities in these industries, so they should qualify for these licenses too. And just as that has happened with minority business applications, a similar thing can and has happened with diversity applicants. So think about this whole analysis about being a resident of a disproportionately impacted area. Now, one thing that people have not been able to control for is something like gentrification. So let's say we had a disproportionately impacted area in a say like Baltimore. What happens is the demographics of that area shift so that when you moved in 10 years ago, you actually weren't being subject to the height of cannabis prohibition enforcement because that area had gentrified. And compare that to someone who, had lived in that area 20 years ago in 1990 when the war on weed was at its height. So the diversity applicant isn't easily able to control for those sort of dynamics, right? So that implicates the entirety of that metric. Again, do you hire people from the footprint? Are people on the boards from that footprint? If things like that are making it so that people who aren't the people who we all think about, poor working class Black folks in a city like Baltimore, or maybe poor working class Latinos in a place like PG, there's no guarantee that that metric can actually be used to ensure we get the results we're looking for. And in other places, that has kind of been a consistent reality where someone with money can basically front a person who meets all the criteria, but the actual ownership of the company can be reserved for someone who does not meet that criteria. So this has been a consistent reality in other parts of the country. California has like a micro grower license that's only supposed to be for certain people who have less capital. But of course, the super, super rich people were just fronting, giving certain people who met the requirements, and then basically having those people sell all the cannabis to the super rich people. So consistently, that's what Davon, I think, means in terms of, it's like Jurassic Park. Life finds a way, capital finds a way to be able to extract these best laid plans of progressives and liberals away from their intent and towards bureaucracy, consolidation, and just generally not flowing the resources and opportunities to people who need it the most. So even in places like Massachusetts, who basically have really set out to make delivery of cannabis a national model for diversity, there have been huge delays in the application process. Even though they've tried to accommodate it and they thought about it, you still just have to have like capital on hand. Like if you want to have a cannabis space and you're trying to apply for a license, you have to own that space as you apply. So as you're waiting for the green light to sell your cannabis or to grow your cannabis in the warehouse, you have to be paying rent on that warehouse the whole time. And same thing with like a transportation industry. Like if we made the transportation industry just diversity applicants, you would have to have like a fleet of cars. You would have to have a bunch of people who have like background checks, and they may even have to have like permission to have a firearm, which is really hard to get in Maryland. You have to have a security firm, which is, people don't know how hard it is to get a legal security firm in Maryland. You basically have to be a former cop to get a license to do a security firm. And you have to do all that work and then wait and wait and wait months and months and months to get your approval. And it's no guarantee that you won't be outcompeted by another diversity applicant. So, as previously stated, that's nothing we can truly do that completely ensures that this dynamic won't rear its ugly head. But by explicitly stating, like, you have to show that you're directly connected to a group disproportionately impacted by cannabis prohibition, that makes it so that in the rare case that you have, a middle class, upper class white person who's, selling edibles out their backpack in college, if they happen to get a cannabis charge, they couldn't get expunged or couldn't get thrown out, then that person will qualify as a diversity applicant. And in Connecticut, that possibility was used in some people's minds to basically attack all diversity language in the bill, but it's a real possibility that these proxies will not actually meet the intent. So again, it's not any panacea. I was looking around basically assuming that there's got to be a solution. People just got to be scared to do it. People don't have the political will. And for this issue, that might be true most of the time. But for this issue, there is no silver bullet. There is no magical thing people are just not gully enough to do. You can be as gully as you want. There's nothing you can truly do to guarantee that people will run the business, and especially run the business profitably. There are no guarantees in this game. So what we can do is recognize that there are a few people at the top of the industry who might make a bunch of money. Hopefully some of them might be Black, but no matter who it is, they need to contract with people for services for all the things downscale, down at lower levels of capital requirements in the industry who are Black. For example, Uber. Uber is coming for cannabis delivery. Like I said, a lot of people, especially pandemic, don't want to go to the dispensary. They're getting weed delivered like Uber Eats. And Uber, the company, wants to be the entity that controls how the cannabis is delivered, which means that all the Black folk that we want to be employees, maybe have a union, maybe get paid for that full time they're in their car. If Uber comes in and controls that, they only get paid when they're actually doing a delivery. So that's a huge difference in autonomy. It's a huge difference in earning possibility if all the Black folks in our community are forced to work for Uber versus owning their own transportation firms and incentivizing large cannabis dispensaries and growers to subcontract those transportation companies. So it's a huge, huge difference in something that seems very small and technocratic. But if we let Uber take in this industry, we all basically get to be serfs for Uber. We all get to work for them versus actually working for ourselves, getting paid a salary per hour we work, not just when someone wants cannabis delivered to us and hope they tip us so that we can pay our light bill. It's a huge, huge difference. So we need the capital investment to make those type of things possible so that people can pay for their cars and pay for their spaces in the months and months and months it might take to get those licenses approved. We need to make sure the criteria that approves those licenses are most desirable for the people who we really want to get those licenses. And we have to recognize that not everybody's going to be the cannabis kingpin. Not everyone, it takes $20 to $50 million for a full-scale cannabis grow. Very few people can play that game. It takes, the range is like 5 to 15 million for a dispensary. Not everyone's going to play that game. But you can make edibles. But is the dispensary going to sell them? Do they have an incentive to work with you as a small Black business? We can work that incentive into the bill. We have people who can do party promotion and create social consumption spaces where people get to consume cannabis and have a good time. They're not even touching the plant. All you need is a warehouse. Does that person have access to capital? Can they have that person have a business plan? And the last thing, obviously, is like head shops. Like, you don't have to sell the plant. You can sell the bongs, the rolling papers, the glass. You're not touching the plant, but that can be a very profitable industry that someone's going to make a bunch of money off of. And if we have the incentives properly aligned, that can be our people, and it can actually be some of the people, no guarantees, but some of the people who we think of as working class, middle class, Black folks who have been impacted by cannabis prohibition, actually getting those opportunities that everyone's talking about. But we have to be creative. We have to realize the reality of the industry versus the mythology of the industry. People think it's just money raining down from the sky, and people just aren't serious enough to demand that we get our cut. The reality is just far more complex than that, and it's going to require for us to have a mature, realistic approach to this industry and to the actual strategy we take so that we can actually get the opportunities our community needs.
So before we transition to Q&A, just a real quick addition, one of the things about the social equity provisions is that it's duplicative of existing infrastructure. And one of the things we want to do is to make sure that we invest in current Black infrastructure that exists that isn't resourced well enough to provide the resources needed to provide the kinds of technical assistance that we think is needed in order to make sure that Black people have real access to the industry. So that's another reason why for us, we decided that the social equity element that's been in some of the previous bills in Maryland and around the country is not the way to go. So for those who are listening after we've done it live, we're about to transition to a Q&A. I'll make sure to read the questions out loud so that the folks who are listening to this will hear the question. So Adam, we can take them one by one. I think we only have about 4 questions or so. So yeah, you just put them up in the order you got them, Adam. All right, so this question is from our dear sister Zakia. What happens if a teen gets caught with marijuana? I think that's probably a Michelle or a Yanet question. So which one of y'all wants to take that?
So the bill would make it just a civil penalty. They'd also be accompanied with information about underage marijuana use, but it would be treated as a civil penalty and not a criminal penalty.
All right. Anything to add to that, Michelle? Was that good? Cool. Next question. Von Tasha Sims, what about home grow? There is a home grow provision in the bill. You go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I appreciate her for raising that. So there is a home grow. It's up to 6 plants. Folks will be able to grow up until 6 plants. And if you live with another adult in the same dwelling, you can you can grow up to 12 plants.
All right. What's the next one we got, Adam? When will the bill be introduced? Who will be the sponsor in the House? So we're waiting on the bill to drop any moment. We've sent some final comments to the bill drafter. So we hope to get the bill from Senator Carter this week. Just to do a little bit more explanation of how this is looking, and I should have mentioned this at the top, the Speaker of the House of Delegates, Adrian Jones, has decided to put in a bill that's a very straightforward referendum bill. So it literally goes to the voters in this year's general election as to whether it should be legalized. So that's the position the Speaker is currently taking. The Senate has taken the approach of wanting to pass something that legalizes marijuana and iron out all the details needed in order to make sure that the policy is sufficient. So the two chambers are in different places as it relates to what the outcome should be at the current moment. So we don't have a House sponsor because it seems that the Speaker is pretty clear about the position that she is currently taking. We think that there's a potential to find a compromise. Hopefully what we've talked about can complement that. So we're hoping that it can be a referendum plus, but that plus is going to come from the Senate, likely come from the Senate side of the Maryland General Assembly. So and I should also mention there is a informal Senate work group that is chaired by Senator Feldman. So the question will be which bill will get out. And so if it's the chair of the formal work group's bill that gets out, our hope will be that Senator Carter's bill is leveraged to make sure that certain provisions get in the bill that reflect the principles that we've talked about. So we're going to be fighting for Senator Carter's bill because we think it's the ideal bill given all that we discussed and talked about. And our hope is that would be the bill that will come out. So we want to encourage everybody who's listening now, who'll be listening later, to make sure that you tell your state senator, your legislator, that they want Senator Carter's bill to come out of the Senate. All right. And we got one more question, I think. What percentage of council members that support cannabis legalization? So I don't know. What I do know is every time that we've mentioned the idea to local legislators, to council people about the idea of the revenues coming back to the councils, many of them are happy about that. So we imagine that this will naturally gain a lot of support from local legislators, local city or county legislators. We imagine it'd be quite popular, given that it gives them an opportunity to be a part of a process to distribute resources to the community, which I'm not sure exactly how it works in other jurisdictions. Baltimore City is a notoriously strong mayor system where our city council doesn't have very much control over the distribution of resources. So if it's anything like that, this would be something that would be of interest to council people to be able to be a part of a process to distribute resources to the community. Anybody have anything to add to that? All right. Okay, so one of the last things that I'll say, well, first, let me just thank all of our participants in tonight's discussion. Really appreciate it. We thought it was so important to make sure that we could really iron out all the details of cannabis legalization in the state of Maryland. It's a priority. It's a hot button issue. One of the things I want to make sure to mention, Yanet and I actually had a conversation with some members of the Black Caucus. And it is our understanding that the Black Caucus of Maryland is hugely supportive of what we have laid out this evening. And so, we're very encouraged by that, that we're going to have the Black Caucus's support on this version, on this very radical version of marijuana legalization and reparations. We're glad to have been able to talk to the Black Caucus and to have their support on our approach to this policy. So I want to thank all of you for coming on to help the community better get a sense of what we're hoping to do and to provide people the information they're going to need to help push us forward during the Maryland General Assembly. So I want to thank you again, Michelle, for being with us. Thank you, Yanet, for coming through. And as always, Lawrence being on the team, our director of research. So I want to thank you all. Before I let you all go, I just want to say just some quick words. I know Michelle and Yanet talked about just some of the public safety aspects of the conversation around marijuana legalization. And I just feel compelled to say, because I think it's at a fever pitch. It's at a fever pitch in terms of the conversation around public safety. It's going to impact a lot of the stuff that's going to move during this General Assembly. And one of the things that we should all be frustrated with is that law enforcement, because of the war on drugs, has adopted an approach to public safety that has not made our community safer, that has not made them more effective in actually apprehending those that are the drivers of violence in our communities. And there hasn't historically been a tremendous investment, nearly to the extent there has been in law enforcement, and community-based alternatives that are essential to sustainably dealing with public safety. And, you're going to hear a lot of Republicans and even some conservative Democrats kind of bellyache about the spike in violent crime. But I don't see many of them in the communities of people who are dealing with violence every day. I was on a Sunday evening, and shout out Tendaya Family. It's an organization that does work at East Baltimore. And it was a 5:00 Sunday meeting where there's about 35 people there, mostly young people, talking about how to address violence. And I don't see any of these Republican lawmakers or these conservative Democrats in the rooms with people who actually took time out of their day on a Sunday afternoon during the NFL playoffs to talk about violence in their communities, to figure out solutions. And so what I want to, and it is ideological that many of the people who are publicly criticizing Baltimore for the issues around public safety do not address the incompetence and the corruption of law enforcement. Because many of the things that Michelle and Yanet talked about in terms of the importance of decriminalizing the way that law enforcement interacts with us based on marijuana prohibition, those tactics have not been helpful in addressing violence, but the corruption have allowed these to be tools used to circumvent the incompetence of law enforcement that has come as a result of the tremendous corruption. And there's not been a real substantive engagement in that conversation. And so I mention it here as we talk about cannabis legalization, because the issue of public safety will likely be used as a reason not to pass this kind of legislation. It's going to be used. There's some people that are going to be reluctant to push this kind of legislation because it'll be characterized by those who have not made a cogent argument about public safety, the Republicans and conservative Dems. It'll be used by them as a reason to be reluctant in pushing forward this policy. And so I'm raising it here. I actually wrote a piece in Maryland Matters that was published about a week or so ago that lays out the arguments that we make. And I want to make sure to put that argument out there because it will be, and in some ways has been, weaponized against the work that we're trying to do. So I just wanted to put that on people's radar as something that's going to be really important that the community help push back against so that we can push this stuff forward. So with that, I want to thank everybody for being with us. Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, as we mentioned in the beginning, and as you see at the bottom, become a sustainer. We're able to be unapologetically Black in our advocacy because the basis of the support we get comes from you. Be a sustainer to make sure that we can continue to bring you this kind of program and bring you this kind of information and advocate unapologetically for Black people. So with that, I'm Davon Love, Director of Public Policy, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. Safe travels. Enjoy the rest of your night.